All right, this is Unscripted with Tory and Kevin, and we are going to be talking today about problem solving. Solving problems. This is something we're all doing every day, but we may not look at it with a framework, with an approach of how could I solve problems more effectively. So Kevin and I are going to talk through a framework I've been developing today. Kevin's going to give me some feedback and give his thoughts on what are the parts of it that don't make sense so that we can take a look at this problem solving framework and make it useful for anyone who's solving a problem that is complex, which I would wager is probably anyone. What do you think, Kevin? I think all of us deal with complex problems.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Nice. Well, so I'll start up front just by defining what I mean by problem and problem solving here. At least for me, and I'll put this definition out there for you to respond to, Kevin. I can look and find, definitions of problems in academic literature. But at least for me, as I work with coaching clients, the thing I see that gets me to problem is a gap between reality and our expectations, right? So we think our expectations, wants, or desires.
Mhm.
So we want something to be this way. We think it could be this way. And our problem is that it's not. That's a way I've been thinking of problem, right? Before we even get to solving problems. How does that definition sit for you?
Well, it's funny. There's already a room in my brain for that definition, and that's what I call stress. Stress is the difference between kind of what you're experiencing and what you want to experience. But I think it's fair to describe that stress as then a problem that you want to resolve, and I think it's fair to frame it in the way that you have. Because you could also test the inverse and say, if I'm experiencing the thing I want, like I don't really have a problem anymore. But then when you start to separate those two things again between what you want and what you have, then that becomes a problem to solve. Um, yeah, I'll stop there. 'Cause maybe I'll say the one thing I've learned is this is maybe some other people know this already, but what I used to think is that I always had to I had to like push the problem to the place I wanted to go, but I've also learned that I could let go of wanting it to be different, which is how I resolve stress. Like in the stress mindset, like if stress is the difference between what you want and you're experiencing, you could change your experience to be back to what you want, or you could change what you want to be what you're experiencing. I don't know if that would apply here in problem solving as a way to get rid of it, but we could ignore that side maybe and just talk about, let's say that you only want to get to work. Now we're going to apply this particular framework.
Well, and I think it's a good call out, right? And it's part of what I was thinking about with this definition of problem is it's like the gap between reality and your expectations, wants, and desires.
Mhm.
The quickest way you can close that gap is to just change your
Yeah.
expectations, wants, and
Yes.
desires, right? And say, okay, I am okay where I am.
Yeah.
Problem
I was just
solved.
laughing about quickest, not necessarily easiest. That I would say the reason why most of us don't do that one is because it seems impossible to change what you want, desire, etc. It is possible. It's like a different kind of problem to solve, I guess, in yourself. But it's true.
Yeah. Yeah, right. But like really saying, okay, is the solution here changing my expectations, changing my wants, or is it taking actions to try to get the reality a little bit closer to where
Yeah.
I want it to be? And I think both types of problems and solutions exist, right?
Yes.
One where it's really like, okay, like our expectations are way out of pace with reality and that is not helping us. Let's take a look at them. And another where it's like, we've got a noble goal, right? We're training for the marathon and we're not in marathon shape and we can think our way out of doing a marathon, but if we want to do a marathon, we have to start actually taking actions to get ourselves into shape. And so I
Yep.
think there are both types of problems, but that notion of like there's a gap between reality and my expectations, wants, and desires gives you the opportunity to both confront reality, get very real about where you are and where there might be
Yeah.
gaps, but also say, okay, are there cases where my expectations, wants, and desires are
Yeah.
out of pace with
Yeah,
reality?
I'm laughing because we started this problem solving episode very philosophically, as opposed to very tactically. I
Yeah,
think it's a
oops.
funny approach, but it's true, and I think it's a way to, if you marry these two ideas together, it's a way to solve problems in a low stress state, meaning like kind of accepting where you are in the journey. That way, even if at a macro level you still have this thing that you want to reach out to this goal or this future state, rather than be stressed by the gap. You could just say, "Oh, I'm on a journey. I'm applying Tory's framework. I am present wherever I'm at, and I'm okay now. If I just draw this micro, I'm where I'm at. I'm on the journey, and I'm not stressed about it. But that's not going to prevent you from continuing to strive to get to where you want. So you can still solve problems in a low stress state. I think that marries the two ideas together.
Well, so it's interesting. I'm just going to thought experiment this while we're in the philosophical, and then I want to get tactical and practical as well. If we say that you can resolve many problems by changing expectations, wants, and desires, by just saying, I'm on a journey, are all problems solvable that way? Or are there some class of problems that are not solvable simply by changing our expectations and wants?
That is now you're very philosophical, and I would say that the every problem can be solved because you just change. And now, obviously, you could think about all these. What are like my brain went to what are all the worst problems that I think I could experience? And technically, all of them no longer are problems if I want that. But it'd be very rare for me to convince myself that I want that. But so I don't know if that's a really satisfactory response to your highly philosophical question. But I think the like true answer is yes, all problems can be solved that way. It's just uh, unlikely. Like yeah, it's just unlikely to get to that state.
Well, and because almost, all problems could be solved if we just took away the desire, the expectation. But for some things, we actually choose to hold it, right? If we say that marathon example, I don't have a problem about being unfit for marathons if I take away my desire to run
Mhm.
marathons. But if
Yeah.
I have committed to it, then yes, thinking is going to be part of the process. Mindset is going to be part of the process. But there are some actions I need to take to close the gap with reality. And so I would almost say, yes, any problem could, in theory, be solvable just by changing our
Mhm.
mental expectations and beliefs. But for the problems that we choose to solve, for the problems that we label as important, because this expectation, this desire is actually something we want to see in the world, then we get to that state of, okay, how do we close the gap between the reality and where we want it to be? And so
Sure.
it's maybe some triage, right? Of like, is this a problem that can be solved by changing expectations alone? If not, if this expectation or desire really matters to you, then what are the steps we take to get there? I'm thinking of this almost stepwise. I don't know. How does it sit for you, Kevin?
I think that's good. Let's dive into the stepwise. Let's get a little bit tactical and think about how we might make progress towards these things we care about.
Yeah. Well, and so that really for me, as I've been developing this framework, working as a coach, I often see folks taking what I would consider low yield approaches to solving a problem. And I know you were saying this word yield may not be meaningful, so I'll describe what I mean here, which is they have a problem and they have a place where they want to be, and the reality is far from that. And the things they do to close the gap aren't meaningfully moving them towards their goal. That
Mhm.
can come from a lot of reasons, right? They maybe haven't defined the destination or haven't defined it well. They may not know what actions can meaningfully move them towards the goal. But it sort of is this feeling of sputtering on solving a problem that I see folks in a lot. I think the metaphor that I feel is most apt for this is that sense of banging your head against a wall, right? The folks have this problem that they just keep sort of
Mhm.
telling themselves they're solving and it's not moving. And so part of where I'm developing this framework is to help folks get unstuck from those types of problems, right? To step back, take a look at the destination, take a look at the approach, do some thinking around each because I believe here that there's some contemplation, some reflection, some examination that can get folks to there. There's some problems where examination is probably not going to help us fix them, right? Like peace in the Middle East, we've done a lot of examination, like that's probably not the solution.
Yeah.
But for many of our own problems, our life challenges and choices, reflection, examination, choice are the tools that can get us unstuck. And so this is me seeking to create a framework based off of some common challenges that I see clients facing.
So do you address, so I was thinking that resonates. I definitely have personally experienced and seen where one of my thoughts, I don't know if you said this specifically, is this kind of ignore or avoid of a problem, and you'll hear someone on their deathbed lament that they wish they had done this thing, which meant they probably always had this desire, but they didn't let themselves want it enough to make progress on it for whatever reason. They that would challenge their identity. A lot of people would rather have not tried something than try and fail. And so I bet there's this avoidance or ignoring a problem. And then there's the other where it's like, I wrote putter. I don't, you said something else, but like there's a, you're kind of like walking in circles, at the beginning and you really want to make progress, but you don't know how. And so maybe you think about it a little harder, or you do some things that aren't really driving you tangibly toward your goal. And so does your framework address those? Or are you just acknowledging that those exist, or is there something there about like how to snap out of maybe one of those modes?
Well, and I think those are sort of the like presenting moments where this framework is useful to you, right? Like
Okay.
either where you're puttering or where you're avoiding. Of course, if you're avoiding, you may not even realize. So it's probably going to be more likely the putterers. Before we jump in on the framework, if you think of examples, right, we've been talking philosophically, if you think of concrete, of those problems we see ourselves or other folks avoid or
Mhm.
putter, what examples come to mind?
I feel like I should probably use my own instead of picking like other. So I'm trying to think. Um, I mean, I would say something like I always had this desire to be entrepreneurial. Like it's kind of in the back of my head. Was that way in middle school, had the newspaper route, had the lawn care, did the shoveling snow, raking leaves. I would go to Kinko's, which is a printing place, and, print out little flyers and I would stick them in mailboxes. And then went to high school and college and I got a regular job and did things. And now here I am in my 40s, having actually started, I'll say, quote unquote, real business. I certainly wasn't an LLC back in middle school. So, like, official real business. And, there's certainly a long time in there where I told myself, like, I'm not an idea person. I kind of like decided that I wasn't capable of doing the thing. And so I was like, I just need to wait until someone has a brilliant idea and then taps me on the shoulder and says, Kevin, will you help me bring this to life? Then I could be entrepreneurial. And so I didn't really let myself, yeah, so it's kind of this ignore avoid probably more so than putter. I wasn't like writing up business plans, and then putting me in the trash. Like, so I was definitely more in the avoidance. So that's an example, I think, that comes to mind when you ask that question.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. It's making me think that the ignore, avoid, right? The thing that comes to mind is you're describing that as almost the James Clear framework that to develop new habits, we have to identify that we're becoming someone new, that we're changing, that we're actually modifying part of our identity. And for cases where that is uncomfortable, undesirable, where we haven't given ourselves permission to change our identity, all these other pieces sort of can't fall into place without that permission, right? Permission to
Yeah.
explore what it would look like to to be this. And then we can go out and take the actions. But I wonder whether many of the times we're avoiding this just because that permission to be something different and to have it maybe look different or weird or something we're not accustomed to or not allowed to be, that permission might be getting in the way. I don't
Yeah,
know.
that definitely resonates. I definitely love James Clear's stuff. I don't know, I can't tell if exactly he made me think this way, but I was gonna say I certainly use words of de-affirmation. I had negative where, I am not a thing, and that became an identity. And when I started wanting to invert that, I did have to practice. They even had a coach that made me practice saying the inverse words. And okay, I am. And she even asked me to like in the mirror, like say 5 times, I am blah. And it's funny because when you do that, it does change things. I've certainly come late in life to believe in the power of words and your own brain. And if you just say I am a thing, like slowly you start like, oh, what would an entrepreneur do? Oh, they would have to come up with ideas. Oh, I bet they don't just like I don't know, divine the best business idea from a dream and then execute it. They probably have bad ideas. And so, for me, this is what I did, but it was like, I'm gonna write down bad business ideas. And, I even like, it's fine. Like that was part of my coping mechanism to not feel like the bar had to be high. And, I think it was another book, Noah Kagan, I think the million, something for your first million. It's a green book. That's all I remember. Sorry, I don't remember the name, but, I think he had you go through similar exercises of like, what were you frustrated about during your day? And I would have to really think about that. Okay, oh, hey, this thing was annoying. I would solve that. That was like my bad business idea or whatever. And I just practice. And so it's like there was an identity, kind of transformation that was led by sort of words of I am this, then thinking about what are the behaviors and habits of people who have that identity and kind of that was the journey. So I'll stop rambling there, but that was my thoughts on your identity part.
Yeah,
Identity.
well, it's so interesting then if I sort of picture in my head this gap between reality and right some expectation, desire, et cetera, that we've conceived of as problem, almost one big wall in between those two, right? Between where you are and where you could be is identity, right? And things we believe about ourselves and
Yes.
things we tell ourselves to be and almost words we own. I've seen this so often working with job seekers because one of the first things they want to do is work on their resume. For me, I've always been like, that's not the most high impact thing to work on right away. But I wonder as we're talking, it's partly almost I want to work on the new identity I'm forming. And this resume is sort of an expression of that. And so this like exercise of actually putting new buzzwords around yourself at least for me, when I see job seekers do it, it takes much longer. It sort of isn't, it can't even be just in the mirror. It has to be in conversation with others and have others sort of say, like, yeah, you do know quantitative methods, right? But like this sort of stepping into new identities process, I think
Yeah.
occurs to a lot of us. And I don't think many of us actually think about it when we're solving problems, right? We think about what are the steps, et cetera, but this like, what new identity am I stepping into? What old identities am I letting go of? Really important when we're making these life decisions and changing these things in our lives.
Yeah, I haven't put together a resume in a long time, but I was thinking that there's a subtlety here because a resume could also be in the kind of puttering phase where you think you're making progress, you tell yourself that you're making progress, but really you're just standing still. Because if you're just rearranging and kind of debating your resume, you're not actually making progress. But there may be instances, to your point, where you really have to like other people struggle with confidence. I do as well. And it's hard to toot your own horn and maybe on a resume you're underselling yourself and that might be an element of identity is like, I'm just imagining now, like if I were writing a resume now and I kind of challenged myself at the beginning to say, what would an amazingly confident person sound like when they're, describing my history? And you could almost practice, and maybe you pretend you say like, well, I don't have to publish this. I'm just playing, and I'm going to do this amazingly overconfident one. Like that could be a good exercise in identity transformation, as opposed to puttering. That could be interesting.
Yeah, but I will say puttering on resumes, having worked with folks on job searches for a long time, is one of my pet peeves because there's actually like a whole culture on this around LinkedIn where people just say like, yeah, I do my resume and then I send it out and like I sent out 100 and I didn't get a job, so I'm going to send out another 100. I'm going to send another 100, and it's this like hustle culture turned into resume sending. And for me, that is the ultimate form of puttering where you're sort of, I sent out 50 resumes this week. So I'm convincing myself that I'm making progress on my job search, right?
Yeah.
And for me, this is sort of one of the most canonical low yield things that I see, which is that actually the highest yield thing you could be doing if get a job is your solution? And I
Yep.
think it may be something about identity, but it may be something about there's almost like a brainwashing of just that getting a job is just
Yeah.
about the hustle. And it is partly about the hustle. You got to put it yourself out there and it's not comfortable. But the notion that the hustle alone, just the clear volume of resumes you send out, or the perfection of your resume, right? That there is some one perfect resume that we're all striving towards. Those are some of the most common low yield things I see job seekers do, and they're some of the most common like puttering type instances of this. And
Yeah.
I guess until today, sort of that notion of like, but how does identity play in there, right? Is their identity job seeker? Is their identity the thing they're moving from? Have they taken on the identity of the thing they're moving towards? I do think that's a component to draw in, but it's not one that most figure in when they're busy puttering.
Yeah, and this makes me want to bring up the analogy around the door opening, around low yield and high yield, where, if you want to get through the door, if you're pushing at the hinge, it's going to take an immense amount of force to get that door to move. Whereas if you move to 2 feet to the left, you can kind of with your pinky finger, push that door open. And so in this case, I think the cold brute force outreach of resumes is like pushing on the door hinge to try to get through the door. And so this, I don't mean to lead you somewhere on your own framework that I don't know, but like if someone has that awareness through this conversation that they're in, whether it's a job search or something else, they're like, oh, I'm pushing on the door hinge here. How do they uncover the higher yield strategies?
Yeah. Well, for job searching, there just are higher yield strategies, right?
Of
It's just
course.
that is one tool. Like it's just, I don't know, at least for me, I think of this, I've done this so many times that it's just like there are higher yield strategies. So, like, that one is sort of the no one that's talked about in LinkedIn. But realistically, a job, at least until AI takes this over, is two people, right? It's a person who's going to hire you. So, talking to people, reflecting on your own wants are far
Mhm.
higher yield than working on a resume. I guess the thing I was wondering though is, I think I often look to work smart instead of work hard. But I think a lot of people, and this is partly what I'm seeing on LinkedIn, is there's this like celebration of working hard, even if it's not working smart, right? This celebration of like, I pushed on the hinge 300 times and finally
Yep.
the door closed.
Yep.
Yay. And everyone else says, okay, sign me up to go push that hinge 100 times. And so I guess I'm curious for you, if do you have a sense for why folks wouldn't take that sense to say like, hey, I've banged my head against this door 100 times, nothing has clicked. Let me take a step back and look at my approach. I don't know that that occurs to most folks unless I'm working with them and I say, like, let's look there. And I guess I'm curious, why folks choose the work hard instead of the work smart. Is it that we've just lionized working hard above all else? I don't know. I'm curious.
Uh, yeah, a complicated question, I guess. I'm sure that there's a lot of like that's typically a value people have around effort and putting in the work, and like you said, we do celebrate that. And but I think people self-identify like I'm a hard worker. It also feels like something that's in your control, and so that there's an agency element. So like, okay, I can do this, and okay, maybe it's not working, but I just have to do more of it. And that's kind of where I was asking about, like, let's say you have this awareness. I think it's really difficult for people to uncover alternative strategies. That's like, especially if we're all dealing with all sorts of novel problems we haven't seen before, what is the equivalent for any other kind of problem, scaling your company or solving a go-to-market thing or, an acquisition or like you get an infinite number of problems. They're all going to have low yield and high yield. And I think it's just there's so much that a human, an individual human would have to learn in order to have effective high yield strategies for every problem they might encounter. And so, there's a little forgiveness I have around people who like just don't know. They've never, how many times do you search for a job really or like change industries? Like, there's a limited number. And maybe when you were junior, like that worked because that, I don't know, you didn't have a network anyway. And so you just did that thing. But yeah, I think it's kind of complex values and then so many novel problems. You'd have to be infinitely knowledgeable to know the high yield strategies for every problem. That's got to be difficult for folks.
Yeah, no, and it's a good point. I mean, I do think if I go back to this metaphor of like the problem, right? Here's the reality, here's the destination, and one blocker is identity. Another is lack of knowledge of the available means to
Yep.
get you to the destination, and lack of knowledge of which are sort of the fastest means, right? Which is the
Yep.
car, which is going on foot, which is crawling. And it was funny, it reminded me of, I posted this thing on LinkedIn and it was one of my better traction posts. And I put this figure of just like 20 things you can do for your job set search mapped based on effort versus impact, right? And people really loved it. And it's this reminder that, like, yes, you're right. Resume and sort of browsing LinkedIn might be the places folks go because they're the only known solutions. So it's almost
Yep.
like if I've never realized that I can open this door from out here and all I think I have available is there because that's all I've known, because that's all I've practiced, because that's what people are saying is important, I'm just going to go push on the door. Where I think once you illuminate folks to the fact that like that is a thing you can do, right? Like sending out resumes, working on your resume, part of a job search strategy. But if it's your entire job search strategy, you're leaving leaving strategies off the table, you're leaving actions off the table. So there is this sort of this when you go from low yield to high yield, it's because you've sat down to consider, are there other solutions available besides the one I'm taking? Right. And so that's sort of, okay, if I'm here and I want to reach a destination, what are five possible means of getting there? What are 10 possible means of getting there? And which one feels like it will move me there the quickest? Where, yeah, folks may just sort of take the known action because it feels like it's the most familiar, it's the easiest, it's the one they're able to make progress on the most quickly.
Yeah. And I'm at the risk of, I guess, going into maybe a sensitive area and also being philosophical. The thing that I started thinking about was ego protection. And, pushing on the door hinge or sending out a million resumes, then you can go to sleep at night blaming the job market for the lack of having a job. And, that way you can still protect your identity of being a capable person. You don't have to expose yourself to the potential that you aren't competing well with other people. And there are other people that are more capable or smarter, have better background, whatever that is. And so I do think there's an ego protection thing that allows you to like blame others for your circumstance, as opposed to acknowledging the agency you do have and then being willing to sit with that and say, oh, ooh, okay, I'm actually not competitive in this job market. It's not the market's fault, it's my fault. And I'm gonna have to go learn some skills, or I'm gonna have to take a backward step to transition an industry, whatever it might be. But I do think ego protection is probably huge here. And most people aren't aware of it. Like it's hard to I see that your own identity, or sorry, your ego is getting in the way. So I bet there's a factor there. What do you think about that?
Yes, and it's funny now I'm picturing I have this like metaphorical landscape I'm picturing in this gap between reality and your wants and desires, and I have this like wall of identity, and I have these various modes of transport, the boats and the motorcycles that are waiting for you, and I'm now picturing ego as like this rain cloud, this like thunder cloud that's just going to come like rain all over this stuff and totally like sap
Yeah.
your progress from moving forward because it's just like, yes, if there is this danger of your ego being threatened, it's going to come in and say like, just don't do this at all. Like do the low impact stuff. The other thing I have realized job searching with folks after all these years, and I've now worked with folks on 100 job searches, which is way more than most folks do in their own jobs, right? There's a part of it that is vulnerable. It's an exercise in vulnerability because you're saying, I don't want to stay where I am.
Mhm.
I don't know where I want to go next.
Yep.
I don't even know about what's out there. Can I maybe talk to someone in an informational interview? I think that often a reason folks stay with resumes versus informational interviews or conversations is conversation is vulnerable. You have to admit to someone sort of face to face, I don't know where I'm going,
Yep.
right? Like, I don't know. I'm not totally satisfied where I am, and I am in a transitional moment. That's hard to admit. And so the resumes are nice because it's like you don't have to admit that to anyone. Like, you can sort of fire this off in the dark of night, and no one except the algorithm has to know that you're job searching. And so that vulnerability that is part of job searching, which is realizing, like, yeah, I am in a state of non-knowledge and uncertainty. And the way to close that gap is to go out and get more knowledge.
Yep.
I find this especially with PhDs. With PhDs, it's very hard to admit you don't have knowledge because your whole training is like making you this master and expert. And so to say, like, yeah, I actually don't know how to job search, it is true. It's not necessarily easy to admit.
Yeah. Well, you're making me think of maybe I feel like I'm getting into another delicate area, but a lot of people stay in jobs they hate. We even have this whole term, the devil staying somewhere that is not great. But, to your point of vulnerability, like having to acknowledge that this is not great and being willing to go on that journey to find something better can be very, very daunting and very difficult. And people would rather stay with I'll use company in this case that is not treating them well because it's be too vulnerable to go. And the delicate part of this is that layoffs or other events in which you get exited from a company, those are always tough in the moment because often people aren't prepared, and I don't want to discount what it's like to go on that journey. But I don't know that I know anyone who isn't better off after that, in part because that clean break allows the person to iterate on the culture, the type of work, the something they go somewhere that's growing, that values them, and that they're, I said, I literally don't know anyone. I acknowledge there's probably someone out there who is in a worse position, but by and large, I would say that's part of that. It's like you're kind of forced to be vulnerable. You wouldn't have willingly done it yourself, but by having an external circumstance put you in that position, you're actually on a much better path. But that like transition around vulnerability and whether you can do it yourself or have to have an external event is I think really important.
Yeah, well, and if we're thinking about that gap between reality and expectations, some of what you're talking about is just like, will you take the first step? Right? Like, is
Mhm.
where you are compared to where you want to be, like, is that calculus different enough that you're willing to take the first step? And I think with layoffs, it's sort of that the first step is taken for you, right? Like, you are then put in this new situation that you have to respond to. But for people to say, like, I am in a known situation and I want to willingly step towards the unknown for the possibility of something better. That calculus can be very challenging. And so I do think I often sometimes look for folks who've sort of been pushed, right? It's like, okay, you only got a year left of funding, like you got to do this. Sometimes even then, folks don't want to do it, but it's sort of this, have you been pushed into the field to solve this problem? When is it worth it to basically take this reality that you've got that is known, even if it's not best, and go move towards something else? I read this book called, I think it's Why We Change or Why We Don't Change. That's really what it was. It was like 11 reasons why folks don't change. And it's like, it's comfortable over here, it's known over here. And so there is something, there's vulnerability, there's appreciating the unknown, right? I'll use risk, though I don't know if this is formal risk so much, just uncertainty, right? There's uncertainty when you step away from what's known. So that thing that's on this other side, the desire, the expectation, better
Yep.
feel worth it, right?
Yep. Well, I'm gonna ask you this. It's maybe a left turn, but I was thinking about my own transition out of my career, and I read a book about negotiating. I forget which one it was, but they introduced the top concept of a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. It was a BATNA, and it made me recognize that part of the reason. my job at Atlassian was creating stress was because I felt like I didn't have an alternative. And so all the power felt like it was in the company. If they decide, if they do this, then I am subject to that, and I didn't have an alternative. And so I created a page in my Obsidian that was like, what would you do if you weren't at Atlassian? And I started listing things around, oh, I would network this, I would start this thing, I would do newsletter, blah, blah. And after doing that for a little while, I was like, wait, why do I have to wait until I'm no longer at Atlassian to do these things? And so it became a little bit, I would start checking those things off. I started my rucking event, I started my newsletter, I started doing this, and I like slowly made process. And that really changed the power dynamic between me and my company because I was generating options for myself through this kind of slow journey. Does your framework, or do you talk in there about like these small steps that you could take, as opposed to the giant leap?
No, and it's funny as we're talking about this, I'm realizing like how many elements of what I see in coaching are not yet addressed in this framework. And it's good. I have this conversation to help evolve what I'm thinking about. But I do think part of what I see there is like a self-disempowerment, and it's almost like a loss of agency, a loss of sense of self-efficacy. That if folks don't feel like they have permission to move, they feel disempowered, which let's be honest, a lot of the discourse around employers and employees does not put employees in a position of power. And so
Yes.
part of what I love to do is like give people their individual power back. It's like this should be a dialogue, right? Or like you are in dialogue with your
Yeah.
employer because they will end the relationship without caring. So like you can end
Yes.
the relationship too. But sort of that empowerment and that agency and efficacy, because you're not even going to begin to move between where you are and where you want to be if you don't give yourself the power to say, like, this is my problem. This is not the job market's problem. This is not my employer problem. This is my problem that I have an opportunity to try to solve. And I am going to try to go solve for myself, as opposed to, well, I'm going to put this on, chalk this up to like the world being bad and just not take any action on it.
Yeah, the term learned helplessness is coming into my mind, and it's one of those awful old, animal cruelty types of experiments. But they tied dogs down and zapped them, and the dogs could escape. But then they took the restraints off, still zapped them, so the dogs didn't jump because they had learned they couldn't, but they could. And I think about that a lot in this power dynamic that you mentioned. That a lot of employees don't recognize that they've learned to be helpless and that they actually have agency that they have to take for themselves. And and maybe part of our earlier conversation of not being aware, it's not clear what you do to get your agency back, and how do you sit in your own power and kind of fray that dynamic with your company. But learned helplessness is the term I was thinking of when we were talking about like what it means to sit in that place you don't want to be, and how do you get your agency back?
Yeah. Well, and as you're talking about it, it makes me realize how much there's almost like a concerted effort to keep employees there,
Mm.
right? Because if you can keep them there, and this is very nefarious, like pulling the strings, but like if you can keep them there, you keep your employees. They don't think for themselves and sort of say, like, hey, wait a minute, this is not good enough for me. So if you can actually convince them that you hold the cards and you hold the power and that they are just these peons in your system. Right, which again, when you look at a lot of like where financial resources, where decision-making resources, some of it bears out. But in your mind, in your day-to-day actions, all that stuff, you are always still your own owner, your own agent. But I do think there's a concerted effort to disempower anyone in a worker position. And I would put this even with well-paid knowledge workers, right? It's still like you are a worker and we want you sort of staying in the worker zone. And so to take the courage to step out of that and say, like, one, either I'm a choosy worker and I'm going to choose where I want to work, or I'm a highly qualified worker, or like, at least for me, part of what I love about self-employment is like, I'm no longer someone else's worker, right? I am in service of the market and I have to understand that. But yeah, it speaks much better to my personal power calculus. But I do think there's a lot of disempowerment that goes to folks in employees and in universities, it's even worse. I mean, when you're a PhD at Harvard, you're supposed to thank them for the privilege of being there, right?
Mhm.
It's not like you should be choosy about where you should go. It's like you should thank us for the fact that we allow you to show up and unlock the doors. And so there's a lot of sort of disempowered rhetoric and narrative that I think people get.
For sure. And if I'm not careful, I would go down this path for another 20 minutes. I'm not sure if that's helpful for your problem solving framework. Is there something that you want to bring into the framework and talk about at this
No, no,
moment?
no. I'm open for where this conversation goes. Where were you
Oh, okay.
flowing?
Well, I guess I would say that I agree with you. I think part of it is like kind of tribal human nature. And, wherever we go, we end up with these hierarchies. And, there's a lot that like people in a company do have power. Like the company does decide whether they're going to employ you or not. And, there's a lot of uncertainty from whatever layer below you are to know, how much pushback is going to get me fired versus, kind of keeps me in this realm of employment. Because I think there's, it's like an abrupt into the relationship. Like it's not like it's a spectrum, I guess. It doesn't feel like as much of a spectrum where it's like, oh, I can tell I'm falling out of favor and I lose these things. And oh, at some point I decide it's like I'm employed, I'm not employed. It's almost like a binary. And so that can feel really dangerous for folks to not know, like, when am I going to trigger the switch flipping to the other binary, which is really dangerous for me because now I lose healthcare, I lose my 401k, I lose my social network, I lose all these things. And so like the human nature and the binary, I think then create those kind of true power dynamics where, yeah, people don't advocate for themselves. They have the helplessness and, they kind of get stuck wherever they are. So yeah, that's a thing that we're probably not going to in our lifetime see the end of.
No.
That's going to be a human nature thing for a while.
Yeah. Well, and when I see this stuff, I have to go back to chimpanzees, right? That's my PhDs with chimpanzees. So it's like these dynamics are very, very old. Power dynamics and monopolizing resources, very, very old, not going anywhere. The other
Yeah.
thing I was thinking of as you were talking is if we think of again, I think I'm actually going to create this image. In my mind, it's like a Liz and Molly cartoon. I don't know if you know those ones, but I'm going to basically create my own because I think as we talk about this more, I get this image of like what it takes to solve a problem. And almost the thing that you're talking about is like, do I have floor underneath me?
Yeah.
Do I have ground underneath me? Because if I basically believe that if I take one step, I'm going to fall into the void, like those, I think I saw an element of Mr. Beast games where you have these people
Mm.
like
Yeah.
jumping from column to column and they could like fall into the void. These are the
Yeah.
games that people in power play, right? But this notion of like, if I take a step, I'm going to fall. Yeah, I'm not going to take any step. And so this notion of like, it is safe to walk because there is ground from where I'm going to where I want to go. That notion that there is ground, and that's part of what I love about featuring folks who have like made the journey, right? To almost say like, hey, if I can do it, you can do it, and if other people can do it, you can do it. To almost convince folks that yes, there is ground underneath you, and there's still going to be this wall of right, the sort of permissions and various things, and there's still going to be these various channels. But like, yeah, there is ground to make this journey. Where I think otherwise you may think it's just total open air, and that if you're going to step, the whole world is going to crumble underneath you.
Yeah, I think the BATNA is the floor. It's the kind of the same thing. It's like, what is your alternative? And if it is falling off the cliff and dying, and you can kind of catastrophize your way out of like, especially if you are on LinkedIn and you see there are a lot of people that are still looking for work. It is not necessarily a great job market, but that's often been true in my lifetime. There are people looking for work, and so you can convince yourself that it's scary, but there's things like building up a runway, like having some savings. That's one of the things, and networking, and that's. I'd love to help people understand the agency they do have and what power they have. And maybe back to your kind of power dynamic thing, there are a lot of companies that prevent people from pursuing extracurriculars. I think partly for that reason. If you did, you would see all these options that you have and you would give yourself agency, and that would create risk for the company for you leaving now. But I like that the company has to work harder to keep you to stay when you're building out all these other things, and it actually makes the company more powerful and all those things. But I can see that being a factor in this as well.
No, and I really do think, at least for me, a healthy employer-employee dynamic is a dialogue, right? Where
Mhm.
it's like both are getting better because both are at their most powerful. But this notion that you sort of have to subjugate one in order for this to work, I do think it's out there. I don't think it has to be that
Yeah.
way. And so it's definitely important to remember that. Nice. All right. So this is not the direction I thought this conversation would go, but it's an interesting direction, right? And
Yeah.
so I think we're basically coming up with all these reasons where, at least for a personal life choice employment decision, right? Of like, do I want to do something new at work? There are all sorts of caveats that go into even starting to take action on the problem, let alone like what actions we're taking. But like even starting to take action, you've got to feel some level of safety in taking a step. You've got to check your ego. You've got to look for, wait, what was the wall? We had a wall and I have it in my mind, but it was the very first thing we were talking about. Do you remember
There's
what the wall was?
there's identity.
Yeah, identity. There it is. So we've got to look at the wall of like how we've built our identity where we are. So these are all sorts of things we have to look at even before we start to take action on this problem. Before we go into methods, right, and high yield and low yield and all that, we've been talking about this in life decisions, in career decisions. Let's quickly teleport this over to company problem solving just for a moment, because I think you work with folks inside of companies to solve company problems. And I'm curious how many of these parameters apply versus don't when we're making big life choices versus a company problem. So say we take a standard company problem that folks are looking to solve, where it's like, we are here and we want to get here. What aspects of this are shared and what aren't?
I'm thinking through this. Companies are made up of people. And so a lot of the things we identify, it's coming into my mind at the decision-making process. I wrote down expansion. I have clients that are wanting to expand. Maybe they want to be part of a different market or serve a different clientele, and that seems too far. So there's some ignorance, ignore or avoid, where it's like I think a leader of a company also doesn't know how everyone in the company would react to things that they might do themselves. And so if you're going to change essentially the identity of a company, how does that affect everyone in the company who may have joined because of the existing identity? It's a much harder thing to, yeah, make a decision. Do I willfully challenge the identity of everyone against their will, or do I bring them along? Do we vote that we're going to go do this thing? Do I just accept that I might lose some people and gain some new ones? So I think identity would come in there, corporate identity. I think, you know, someone might want to go somewhere else, but not know how. So kind of going back into that lack of awareness and how do you know all the different ways? That's where like I would say people like myself, consultants come into play. And I wrote down I was going to ask you how people come in, but how do you get exposure to and access to the knowledge that exists in the world that you don't have personally? And until you get there, a lot of times you don't make progress on the problem because it seems too far. Like you just don't know how to get there. And so there'd be that element as well. There's definitely a lot of puttering. I guess like there's a lot of performance theater in business. Yeah, you meet to talk about how you might do the thing, or you put a paper together to talk about blah. And so it looks like action. You're certainly busy. People are giving you feedback. You are no closer to solving the problem than you were before you did any of that. And I think this goes into like, here's the downside of the learned helplessness that companies think might be good for them. If I shock everyone all the time into sitting still, when I want them to move, they don't move, and it's actually very expensive for a company. So there's a lot of puttering inside of a company. I'll stop there. I bet I could ramble on some more things, but I'll let you ask me some
Well, and so a
follow-up.
couple of observations. One, where we're talking about this individually, all these things are inside of an individual. When it's a company, we've now got a collection of individuals. So the complexity goes up, right? Of like, how do we get other people on board? And like, how do we deal with their idea? Like, there's all these things, but it becomes
Yeah.
multifaceted, right?
Yeah. Well, you made me
Uh,
think of the chimpanzees and people and, the ego protection. If I'm a leader and I want to go somewhere and I think that there's someone on my team that has a skill set in doing there, like, or in getting me there, if I elevate them, I'm creating risk personally for my position in the company because I've got this capable person and my boss will make them the boss. And, I think that comes up a lot in companies where, especially if there's not a growing company or there's a culture of scarcity or fear, then you get this element where you don't put people in positions where they could excel because that limits your value or kind of perceived values. I think there's some ego protection, power dynamic, tribal hierarchy. If you have someone in your team that could do something, you don't want them to be too good because you think that makes you worse off.
And what's interesting for me there is at least what I experienced a lot at a big company is the conflict between company incentives and personal incentives.
Mhm.
And as the company gets larger, to me, those get further and further away. Because the
Yep.
personal incentives are just how do I build and consolidate power? How do I
Yep.
give myself safety for a job? Where the company is like, how do we actually make revenue for the company? At a small company, there's just not as much space for there to be gap between those two because it's like if you're off running a personal agenda and the company dies, like, right? So my belief is that they're a little more aligned, that maybe I'm off. But I do think really looking at this whole picture of a problem of like, whose problem is it? Is it your problem Is it the company's problem, right? Like that sort of lens of who owns the problem definitely impacts how to solve it. And I do think one of the things that gets in the way of company problem solving is personal agendas, right? And personal missions that don't necessarily fit with what the company needs folks to be prioritizing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we've talked about the book Loon Shots, but I love that book because it speaks to what you're saying. And they even put some equations in there. I think it's essentially Dunbar's number, but there's a break point to your point when you're a small company, whether you solve the problem affects your survival. And so really everyone is oriented to solve the problem. It doesn't matter who does it. Just solve it and solve it fast. Then, when you get bigger, what matters more is whether your boss is happy. And in an ideal circumstance, what makes your boss happy is what makes the company successful. But that is not true. And I've had a boss tell me that my review is based on whether these three people are happy with my and like happy is very different than like effective in solving the problem. And I recognize the circumstance where I'm meeting with one of these people and I want to challenge them on what they're doing because I think that would make the solution better. But in doing so, I'm making them unhappy with me on a personal basis, even though it solves the problem. And I was like, what a funny thought for me to have in my head at this company where I bet if you ask the owner or people who really care, they want the problem solved in the most effective way, independent of whether, people are quote unquote happy. But it's to me, it was an illustration of this particular point where those things diverge and it's more about personal feelings as opposed to efficacy. And the Loon Shots was a really good book to like kind of really solidify that idea.
Well, and it's funny, this is why when I was working in big corporations, I spent a fair amount of time watching Survivor.
Mhm.
Because to me, the like, do people have a good perception of you and do they value what you're doing? That's just the game of Survivor. So like it completely gets separated from like corporate objectives and like, and I always went in there being like, don't we want to make the company money? Don't we want to keep the customer happy? That was not the game when you're at the low to mid level of a big company. And I
Yes.
had to learn that the hard way. And so then when you learn about Survivor, it's about how are folks perceiving you and how do they want to perceive you and how are you helping them? And it's all just power dynamics. And so becomes a different problem to solve. The problem to solve there is like, am I well regarded
Yep.
in this unit versus, okay, is this company bleeding money, right?
Yep.
And so
Yep.
that's a challenge for a larger company. I think when you were talking before, the other things that came to mind about company problem solving, when you talk about the company that wants to expand, and I see this with individuals too, and I don't think we called it out, so I'll put this in my picture, is reality where you want to be. How much knowledge do you have about the destination, right? Like how well can you see it? Do you know what it looks like? Do you have a sense of how good it would be and how much you would like it there? And that's partly why I, for job seekers, encourage them to do informational interviews first for the purposes of exploring destinations,
Yep.
right? It's like if I could go to island A, B, or C, which one captures my fancy? Not like which one can I get to, like which one feels like an island I want to be on. Because I'm going to do all this work to go from where I am to where that is. If it's not even that appealing,
Yep.
what are we doing that work for? And so that sort of destination knowledge, destination research, I think is both important for individuals and for companies of sort of, okay, if we're going to prioritize these efforts to get there, what's the end point and are we happy with getting there?
Yeah, I'll say the thing you made me think of though is vision. I think that's right, and I'll bring it back to your tangible point. But I think that's why visions are so effective. And if you have a good one, because if you can really paint the picture of what it looks like, and that's why. And I don't mean the marketing speak vision. I don't mean all the bad ones that are out there. I mean like literally, can you tell the people in your company what the universe will look like when you all are successful? And often those are never achieved. They're really just this idealized state, but it's such a compelling thing that you want to see in the world that you like drive toward there. And so I think visions are really compelling. And so if you apply that to this, maybe I'll pull it down from this, really high level vision into more of a expanding your market. Like I think the same thing applies to say, what is it like over there? Who are the people? How do they work? What is the culture of this new environment? Or all of those different things that, the grass isn't always greener, as they say, and there's always trade-offs. And so make sure that you understand. I think now to your very specific point, I do think informational interviews are one of the best ways to go do that. My daughter wants to be a fire person, and my wife goes to CrossFit with someone who's a fire person. So my daughter went to the thing, and she loved it. She was like, it's like she went there and spent an hour, and they talked about all the things, and just one of those like, okay, great. Now she feels more confident in her aspiration because she exposed herself to the real people doing the real thing. We'll check in 30 years and see what happened. But this for now, that was just a very interesting example of like wanting to go find out what's over there.
Well, so if I speak to vision, both for individuals and for corporate, because I think we can sort of borrow the term here. The two things that are coming to mind me is almost like how inspiring, exciting is the vision, and then how accurate is it? Now, of course, when it's a compelling company vision, it doesn't have to be totally accurate, but if it's so ungrounded in reality that it's ridiculous, that doesn't inspire folks either. And so it has to sort of be that there's this design principle I heard of called Maya, which is most advanced yet acceptable. And
Okay.
so probably your vision has to be Maya, right? It has to be like advanced yet acceptable. And so it's got to be inspiring, but to some extent like possible, seem possible, but at the edge of possible. And I think when that's the case for, say, a job seeker looking for something new, looking for more satisfaction in work, or for a company saying like, what could the world be if we do our thing well? I think the characteristics of that vision matter. Where too often in job seeking, folks actually just start picking up the bike and picking up the car and picking up the boat and saying, like, how do I get there? Without even
Mhm.
thinking about what the there is, right? Like, where are you going? Where do you want to go? Because we can pick one of those tools later. But like, what's the there that you're headed towards? I do think the characteristics of that vision really matter and sometimes get under indexed when we're solving problems because we almost just jump to the actions as opposed to the destination we're headed towards.
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of people who have gotten to where they thought they wanted to go and then been unhappy with it because of the things you said. And I think there's a difference between like a vision is probably it's not true yet. And so there is no accuracy because you're literally like painting a dream state versus if you're expanding into a new market, that market exists. There are firemen and women actively sitting inside fire stations right now, and you can go see what that is like. That is not, so there's probably a difference between whether it's something that you're intentionally designing as a compelling vision that's a dream state that you aspire to be versus the kind you can actually go find out right now, what that's like. You can learn what it's like to be an author. You can learn what it's like to be any sort of different career and figure out whether that's for you or not.
Yeah. Well, and for informational interviews, the metaphor I use there is like trying a jacket on for size, right? Like you're actually going in and like before you go buy that jacket, go try it on, right? Like
Yeah.
talk to someone who's in it. It's interesting though, then if for companies, if a vision is not accurate just because it's so bold and audacious, what word can we put around it instead? Is it credible? Is it inspiring? Like what are the characteristics of a vision that sort of make it click in the same way that for a job seeker, they've gone out and sort of kicked the tires around it? Because I will tell you, I see people who come to me for job searches where they sort of had an idea of what the end point was like. They got there and it wasn't the fit, either because they misassessed themselves or they misassessed the environment, right? And when we don't do this very much, we're not that good at creating fit. And so I do think for individuals, it's possible to sort of misassess where we're headed or misassess our own satisfaction with that. And so the goal is to try to be more accurate in that prospecting of destinations. For companies, though, I don't know. If a vision is not, yeah, accurate, what is it?
It's not accurate. I was just writing down here. I wrote compel. We talked about compelling earlier, and that's just a word that comes to mind. It's not accurate, but it's compelling. I think the best ones are also values aligned. It's something that resonates with a thing that you want to see in the world. Maybe that's the same thing as that's how it becomes compelling if it's values aligned. It's worth the difficulty. I don't know if there's a word to describe all those things together in one, but it's like it's got to be a thing that's worth striving for. That it's worth putting in the effort. It's worth whatever cost it comes at you personally, but it's got to be values aligned and compelling. I do think there's an element of realism there because certainly, if someone said that they wanted to revert or like cancel gravity, I don't know. I was trying to think of something impossible. I don't know. I guess that could be a compelling vision, but if it's not a thing that I think could be reasonably achieved, then it is a false goal. It's a false ideal. Like it just can't happen. So that probably would work.
Yeah, well, and I've seen the same thing with OKRs and stretch targets, right? If they're too stretch, folks discount them. So this is where I do think that sort of just pushing the envelope of what like could be believable. So I like the word compelling. I like the word inspiring. But yeah, I think it's got to have like a teeny ounce of credibility. And maybe
Yep.
not, right? Maybe there's some enterprises where folks love going and working on the moonshots, the things that seem like they have zero credibility. But I think for many, the sort of notion that this is like pushing the frontier, but just possible is exciting. Where the visions that are too safe, that are too like, well, we're just going to go do this uninspiring thing, they don't inspire folks. So I do think there's probably a sweet spot between, not outlandish, but
Yeah.
outlandish enough to be inspiring, where those can sit in terms of the destination.
Yeah.
Thoughts, other observations that are coming up here?
No, like you made me think of the like if it's physically possible, like I think it has to comply with the laws of physics, and then there's something about there are things that could comply with the laws of physics but would take a long time. I think those are harder visions to sell, kind of to your point. So there's like it has to be true at least, but if it's too far into the future, it'd be really hard for anyone to put the effort in knowing that they would never get anywhere close in their lifetime. And so you'd have to have a really long-term thinker that really was thinking generationally in order to do that. So like I'm with you, but that's what my brain thought of is like it has to be physically possible. But then there's this time horizon of like when, and if it's too far in the future, then even though it's true, it's just not reasonable, and it'd be really hard to sell people on getting there. Much less funding, I guess, to to toil that long. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I think for companies, probably the motions of having a like, this is far enough in the future, but not so far that we're going to fail in the process. Where something more like a NASA, right, can really have more like, hey, we're going to exist, we think, for a long time, so we can take these longer term bets. All right, so I think we talked a lot about this picture, right, of sort of the reality of where you are and the expectations, wants, or desired of where you could be, sort of understanding where you could be, all these blocks in the way. Before we get to looking at like the methods to move forward, there's one other area I just realized as I was doing the diagram we haven't talked about in problem solving, which is getting to know where you are. If
Mm.
I think about one of the highest yield things you can do in terms of solving a problem, basically understanding like, where am I now? And what are the features of where I am that isn't matching the expectation, etc. I think too often when we're problem solving, we look at sort of the possibility and the actions, etc. But if we can really honestly get to know, and this is where for job seekers, it's really like, okay, I hear that you want a job. What's not working about where you are now? What's not satisfying? What does that tell you about what matters to you? Companies, if you're not expanded, what does it say about the company that you want to do that? Like, what is the gap there? And what does that say about who you are as a company? I think that part also gets forgotten in problem solving. So, almost a little bit of excavation of where you are. I do think that can go too far as well. There's sort of an inflection point where it's like, okay, now you've been doing that for a long time and you really just need to step out into the world. But I
Yeah.
do think some amount, especially for job seekers, there's amount of like, what do you value? What are your standards? What's important to you? What are you not getting? That people forget about. And they just put it out there in the market and let the market decide. But that like getting to know yourself, getting to know your sort of agent who is moving through this problem, I think that benefits any type of problem to be solved.
Yeah, I wrote down accept reality. That's one of the things I've written about before. Like you really have to see the world as it is, not as you want it to be when you're trying to affect change. Because if you're not, like you're not going to come up with the right solution, you're not going to push in the right spot. And so accepting reality is really important. And then also that comes into the self-awareness. Like you have to really understand yourself in this whole thing. And this is a small anecdote. Hopefully my wife doesn't get mad, but she's a midwife. And she's done enough births now that she can kind of predict the kind of birth someone is going to have. And it's so funny. It's just like because a woman will come in with an idealized vision of what she wants, and it is possible, but they don't know enough about themselves to know that that's going to be a really challenging vision to achieve given how they approach the world. And so there's just something fascinating about this whole like self-awareness and vision. And to your point, like you have to really see yourself as you are and the version you are. It's in order to get there. So just a minor aside, but self-awareness and accepting reality, I think, are really, really critical.
What does your wife do there when she sees a big gap between what they're asking for and what is likely going to
Well,
happen?
this is where I'll probably get more. I really don't know. I think part of it is one, like anyone, she's just building her professional intuition, where you kind of call something and oh, I was wrong on this one. Why might I be wrong? What am I not taking into account? But then some of it is around like selection criteria, like you're meeting someone and you're kind of seeing, ooh, okay, I hear what you're saying, I hear what you want, but I've done this enough that I think that this is how it's going to go. And, that's not the kind of experience that I want as a practitioner. So I'll say no. So very early days, but I think those are probably the two things that she's probably doing.
Nice, the professional intuition and then the sort of checking whether the dynamic is going to work. And it's funny, I feel like after helping so many folks job search, I have a similar thing where it's like I hear someone talk about like where they are and where they want to go, and I can hear what the risk factors are, within 15 minutes, right? And sort of say like, here are going to be the challenges for you, and here's what's likely going to happen. And this is partly where I find myself wanting to move away from the job search space because as a coach, I probably need to keep some
Yep.
open-mindedness and some like, where could this go? But having just done it so many times, I'm like, sort of know how this is going to play out. And it slips more into consulting. And so then it's like, okay, am I a job search consultant? Who knows? Right. And I do think job searching is one of the things where people just need to make their own choices. But it can be hard not to sort of say, I have seen this so many times. What you are saying, like, that is not going to happen. So I was curious for how your wife handles it.
But it made me think like immediately I was like, man, where am I predictable and I don't realize it? Who could I tell my entrepreneurial story and they could tell me what trajectory I'm on? Because even if I think I'm going somewhere, I'm the same. I've got a vision for I want this business to be, but I'm me and I'm at this stage. Someone who's done this enough would kind of know, oh, Kevin, you're going to have this kind of destiny unless you change A, B, and C about yourself and your approach and your tactics. That'd be really valuable. And so I think I'm this like, you know, unpredictable agent in the world. And I have, the full power to decide. But it's like, actually, I'm on a trajectory. I just don't know it yet because I don't have the knowledge, the foreknowledge.
Wow. Yes, and it's challenging because we all want to believe we're the snowflake.
Yep.
And so then to have someone in and be like, you fit into my framework is not so nice. But at the
Yep.
same time, you can think about like, who's someone who has helped 100 people build companies. This is partly why I like the Steve Blank book because it really feels like someone who's just been through this so many times, where a
Yep.
lot of business coaching is like, I've done this once, maybe I've done this twice. Where I kind of want the person who has done it so many times that this stuff just feels obvious of like, here's where you are, here's where your blocker. And I think with job searching, I have gotten there just because it's like you do it 10 times and it's like, ooh, interesting. And then like 15 times, oh, there's some commonalities here. Where like by 100 times, it's just sort of, and again, most people don't do 100 job searches themselves, right? It's only because I've been party to them and working with other folks that I have that many reps. And so I do think for entrepreneurs, it's really valuable when you can find someone who's basically had that many. Maybe, I don't know, maybe them just telling you you're an X and you're going to go Y doesn't feel very good because you want to figure it out yourself. But yeah, with job seeking, I do think I have enough. And this is partly where this framework is coming in. Maybe I should really think about it with job seeking in particular. But I personally struggle with how do I share that like insight without it feeling like judgment, without it feeling like it collapses the human element of this or buckets folks in a way they don't want to be bucket, right? Like how might that fact that I've done this so many darn times be useful without it denying folks the beauty of the journey that is learning it yourself, right?
Nice.
I don't know. It's a tough tension. I don't know if some entrepreneur could come in and wave a magic wand and tell you, like, you are X, you need to do Y. How would that sit for
Yeah.
you?
Well, just as a random aside, but like I think about the Cassandra complex, which is the old mythology. Cassandra, like I'm gonna butcher it, but it's essentially like I think this woman wanted to have knowledge of the future, and she was granted that wish, but was also condemned with the no one would believe her. And so I saw that in my own work at Atlassian. Like I'd done enough transformation programs and I kind of watched this movie before. I could watch the beginning. I'm like, oh, the leader is wrong in these ways. They have insufficiently resourced in this way. They've got the wrong because and they haven't lined up this, and you kind of know. But no one wants to hear that when, oh no, we're going to figure it out. We're going to be successful. Yeah. And then sure enough, they hit all the, roadblocks that you saw because I built that professional intuition, but it felt a little bit like a Cassandra complex where hey, you need to change these things or this is not going to go well. And everyone's like, no, 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 no. We got this. And they don't. That's Cassandra complex what we think of.
Well, that's an interesting thing. If we go back to this problem-solving image, right? If you have this reality and this expectations, if you then have someone who can come in and be a guide, who can say, hey, we've done this a bunch of times, here's how we're going to do that. It's interesting that so many of us would basically say, like, no, no, thank you. I want to solve this myself, or no, I can do it differently. I do think with job seekers, there is sort of enough of can be a recognition of like, you have done this a lot. I have not done this very much. Help
Yeah.
me do this better. But I do think a lot of times it is still lessons that folks have to learn on their own. And so the guide can sort of say, I have walked this path a bunch of times. Here's what's likely to happen, but you do you. But that's sort of like, how do you bridge that gap between the guide who's been on that so many times and the learner who may have some ego involved, or even if the learner is totally receptive and excited, like they just may not have the groundwork to fully internalize and understand what it is you understand after having walked it so many times. Right?
Yeah.
Like I can go into a martial arts class and have someone like demonstrate exactly how to do something, and I can try to do it, but I can't do it because my body just can't move in those ways yet, right? Like the gap between master and beginner is just too far, right?
Yeah, sorry, I had like a thought and I had a different one. The first one got, re ejected out of my brain, but oh, it was the at the end of my time at Atlassian, like one of the things I learned is you can't advise people who don't want advice. And it's just like what a silly thing to say, but it is true. And it's kind of this point you're making, which is, if someone isn't willing to hear what you have to say, then no amount of you saying it in different ways is going to have any effect. And so that's part of my own, when I'm working with people, a lot of what I'm not a coach. I don't consider myself a coach, but a lot of what I'm looking for is does this person take advice? Because if not, then why am I here? I'm not going to go on that journey to yell things at someone and they're not going to listen. And to your other point, it made me think of the four stages of competence. Where you start with the uh, unconsciously incompetent, I think is where you start. Yeah. So yeah, a person who's done this before could say, "Hey, you need to do A, B, and C," and you're like, "What? How do A, B, and C?" If and especially if it requires a new way of thinking. That is a very difficult thing to just start. So that's like the second layer is like they have to want advice, and then depending on how bunch of a gap there is of knowledge and capability, there's still more work to be done for them to apply whatever advice they're being given.
And so, in addition to this, like, what's the problem? How much do you want to solve it? What are the gaps between you and where you want to go? There is this element of like, how guidable are you? And that's
Yeah.
something I constantly look at a coach, right? And I don't think I have a good mechanism, even having worked now with all this number of people, to sort of like, is this person going to be coachable? I wish I had a better way to triangulate that, but I think there's some discovery of like, are they open to looking at this? Are they open to trying things? Are they open to feeling incompetent in the process, right? It's the process. Well, so we are almost at the half hour. What's standing out to you from our conversation, Kevin? Right? I may not have gone the way we wanted it to go, but what's not even wanted. I like the way it went, but it wasn't the way I expected it to go. So, what's standing out to you?
Oh, we covered a lot of ground. I'm staring at my notes here. I I think we've covered a lot of important elements that people could reflect on in their own problem-solving journey. So again, it kind of goes to the self-awareness and accept reality. It's like, okay, really ask yourself how your identity is showing up here. Trying to figure out whether your ego is also something that's showing up and preventing you from exposing yourself or learning the thing that you need to learn. People could identify whether they're in this like kind of puttering state where it feels like I used to talk about, I think I've written about this, like speed versus velocity, where velocity has a vector and as a direction, speed, you can kind of be spinning in a circle. So thinking about speed versus velocity could be something helpful. Thinking about power dynamics, learned helplessness, kind of taking your agency and figuring out your best alternative to a negotiated agreement or creating a floor for yourself to make it more safe to challenge, something that's not right. Having a compelling vision, looking really into the future, like where do you want to go? How do you get there? And we also talked at the very beginning about some things you might need to let go of. That's an element of solving a problem as well. So I can cover a lot of ground, but for someone who's kind of really interested in solving a problem, I think we gave a lot of pieces that they could reflect on to figure out how to get through.
Yeah, well, and I think for me, I actually really appreciate the complexity we've brought into this topic. 'Cause sometimes when I approach it with a framework, I'm just like, well, this is simple. Why isn't this easier for folks to walk through? And like, if we just run through this, it's like this. I think today I have really appreciated the complexity of each of these different pieces and how many different things have to go right to go from a like, I have a problem to like, I want to solve that problem to I am solving that problem to I'm solving that problem effectively to I have solved it, right? Like, there's a lot that goes into every element of this. And at least for me, the inspiration it makes me want to have is almost to like diagram out these things we've been talking about, and then almost give people mechanisms to see themselves in that, right? To almost be like, here's the cloud of like ego, and for
Yeah.
people to feel like, oh yeah, like I felt that, that's where I am. Because I think so often, if you're solving a problem, you don't really have this map, you don't really know where you are in the map. And so the notion of sort of like, here is a map, and here's some way for you to sort of see what's happening in your problem solving. Even without that saying, like, then here's how to solve it, because I'm the entrepreneur who's done it 100 times, but almost this notion of like, I can see myself here. And because of that, I've turned a little light bulb on where I am. I don't know. That's something that's
Yeah,
inspiring.
100%. I was thinking about the Conscious Leadership Group. I really like their
Yeah.
work and their book,
Yeah.
and they have the YouTube videos where someone's drawing the drama triangle. And so you can kind of literally see yourself, oh, I am being a persecutor or I am being a victim. Those are really helpful. Or the forms of mind, that other framework I really like, and you kind of see yourself in a socialized form of mind, or you see yourself in a self-authored form of mind. So I think that's one of the great things about frameworks is it just you kind of get something on paper and you can sort of stare at it and you're like, oh yeah, I kind of see myself. All right, I see how that element is factoring into what's going on in my world. You're kind of giving everyone the vocabulary and the framework to diagnose their own problems.
Yeah, and I think the text of the framework helps, the structure and the thinking behind it. I do often think the images as well. It's like a different way
Yeah.
that our brain can relate to the concept, and so it can really help us in ways that words don't, right? I saw how when I sent just a written idea of this framework to you, sort of elements of it didn't click. But as we've been talking through it and really breathing more life into it, one, having a conversation gives it a lot more life, but two, I think a diagram sometimes gives folks a way to relate to something where it's a different way of thinking. So
Yeah.
exciting inspiration coming from this. Hopefully, anyone who has made it through and is watching this far has found utility, has found elements of their own problems and their own solutions that they see themselves in today, or learned something, or gotten some humor value, at very least, from Kevin and my conversation. Something's made them smile. So
Yeah.
I'm excited that we've had a chance to talk about this. Thank you for making the time, Kevin.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking with you, Tori.